I think people, this administration is much more prepared and planned this time around in terms of the kinds of chaos that they're trying to unleash. But I think people are also more focused this time around. And what they're doing is a show. Like, it's a weird thing to articulate because there's an enormous amount of damage that is being done. But what they are trying to invoke more than legal programs, more than policy, they are trying to invoke fear more than anything else.
So you remember the last time we spoke?
In the Bronx.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you remember when it was? You're like, there's so many interviews. I do
It was
them all.
COVID.
It was, right? It was May?
Yeah.
April or May of 2021.
Yeah.
You were the first interview I did post
Yeah.
the opening.
Yeah.
Like, we went up to the Bronx. It was like, my God, I haven't been to the Bronx in so long. And we had a great conversation. We saw your office. Mm-hmm. But I remember that, to be honest, because I'm honest, right? Tenías otra cara, right? Mm-hmm. AOC, she's dealing with stuff.
Yeah.
And so we talked about that, right? Because I'm a big proponent of therapy.
Yeah.
And what happened was that it was months after January 6th.
Yeah.
Right?
That was just like 4 or 5 months after January 6th.
And so we talked about, because they came after you on January 6th. And, you're like, I'm a young woman just kind of running for office, doing my thing. And now these people literally want to hang me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So tell us where you are right now, considering that Donald Trump has now pardoned the people who were coming after you.
Yeah. That day changed me. There was a before that day and there was an after that day. I had a moment where I very concretely, like almost on a biological level, believed that I was going to die. Mm. And
so like a near-death experience. Absolutely.
I just felt that way. I was locked in a bathroom and I didn't know there was banging on the door and I didn't know who was on the other side. And I thought it would that was just what it was. But there is a certain inventory that your mind, your body, yourself, that you take when you have an experience like that. Almost making peace with the fact that this was about to happen. And, I felt like afterwards, I had a lot of things that I needed to reflect on. And in some ways, it was like kind of a gift. But in other ways, it was very challenging and very, very difficult. But I think now, I
need to interrupt you. When you say this was a bit of a gift, Sam, my heart just stopped. I'm like, you're saying that kind of having to experience that confrontation with life, death, kind of huge philosophical issue, but also looking at the trauma that you then had to face and grow from. So help us to understand that.
I think so. My dad died at a very young age. My dad died when I was 18, and right after he passed away, I was very close with him. And right after he passed away, of course, you feel like the devastation of a loss, but I also felt an immense amount of gratitude. Like, I felt very grateful because I got to know him. I got to be raised by this person. And so in times of tragedy and travesty and devastation, there's also these gifts of clarity. Yeah. And when I was kind of locked in that bathroom and I thought that it was over at that point, what I had felt and what I experienced and what my mind had experienced was and I was raised in a religious context. I personally am a spiritual person. And I felt like, you know what, if I'm going to be taken in this moment, then that means people are going to be okay. It means that that is what is supposed to be. And that I just had this feeling like they'll take it from here. And I say that because now, like Trump pardoned virtually all the January 6th insurrectionists, including hundreds with violent records, including specifically people who were arrested with specific threats against my life personally. And I don't want to give them my fear. I'm not going to give them my fear. And I feel more like squaring up than anything else. I'm like, if you want to come, come. Because this is like this monster that feeds on our terror. And what they represent are people who they eat fear, they sustain themselves on anxiety, and I'm not going to give them that. I care about other people. I care about my communities. These people need cynicism. They need apathy. They eat fear. They need chaos. They need anxiety. And the more we give them that, the bigger they get. And all of these big, scary things, it reminds me of like at the end of The Wizard of Oz, where they just, you yank back the curtain.
And it's a little guy.
And it's a small, scared, incompetent little man.
Yeah.
And I think we just need to remain focused. Yes, they are capable of immense amounts of damage. It can be scary. It's not something we ignore. It's not something we check out from. But we register it, we say okay, and then we figure out what our options are. And we do the best we can day by day.
So the $65 billion question would be, and you know what I'm about to ask, which is, ¿y entonces qué pasó con los demócratas? After strong midterm elections, after the election of Biden, then strong midterm elections for a president who was, kind of lukewarm in terms of acceptance, but still, and then this. So obviously you've been thinking about this ad nauseum, or maybe not, right? So what happened?
There's a lot of focus back and forth on the presidential. And even now in this moment, there's a lot of people that are kind of saying like, do something. But I think what has not sunk in and what there has not been as much discussion about, at least especially in the consequences for this present moment, is that it's not just that we lost the presidential election. We lost the Senate and we lost the House, which means that at the very least, if Democrats were able to win the House, we could stop bad things from happening. And it doesn't mean that we can always make good things happen, but it does mean we can stop bad things from happening. Now, in terms of the election, I mean, there are so many different factors. And, people can say, listen, we switched out presidential candidates, like on specific levels, right? Like, I think it is just a fundamentally unfair position to be put into having to run a presidential campaign in 90 days. And I think that, completely separate. I just think I think that Vice President Harris took on this enormous assignment with a lot of grace and with as much dignity, and she worked She worked so hard, and her husband worked hard, and their family worked hard. But you have 90 days to run a presidential election against someone who has been running for president for 4 years, 3.5, 4 years. I mean, shortly after Trump lost in 2020, he started his presidential campaign all over again. So he has 3-4 years of nonstop campaigning. He was rallying in this country all the time, constantly, for 4 years. So there's that piece. But I think structurally, overall, the Democratic Party, because of its coalitional nature, is often kind of has this confused message, because they're like, we're supposed to be a party of the working class. And I think working class people, have not been seeing government work for them. And they have not been seeing or hearing the things that they need to see and hear, despite a lot of the things that the Biden administration did do. You know, I think that Biden easily is probably one of the most pro-labor presidents that we have seen in modern history. First president in American history to walk a picket line with the UAW. But then you have Gaza, which I think really tore up a lot of the mobilizing base in the Democratic Party, and this relationship with organizers that the Democratic Party has, that, you know, it's not about like, did it lose us voters? I think it really lost us mobilizers, which made things challenging.
And, you know, for you personally, I mean, I was going to leave this towards the end, but you brought it up. I mean, for you personally, I remember seeing that video of you being confronted on the street. I don't know if it was in D.C. or if it was here in New York.
Yeah.
With protesters raising the issue of Gaza, talking about the word genocide, criticizing you, and you getting visibly upset.
Yeah. And I think there's been a lot of misinformation at play in that space too. And I think to me, like, the frustration, that's sometimes where my frustration has come from. That's sometimes where my heartbreak has come from. Because I have no problem with, of course, activism. But to me, if you're going to take the enormous steps of confronting a public figure, then you should, and recording it and doing what you have to do, then you can probably be bothered to do a basic Google search. And the amount of misinformation that has exploded because people are chasing retweets of a lie has been really painful. Like, we are, especially in terms of social media, we are on the platforms of billionaires. And these billionaires modify these algorithms and they wield them politically. We see that most explicitly with Twitter, but it is also at play on Meta, on Facebook, etc. And, you know, I think it was really hard watching people and communities that I am aligned with fall for right-wing misinformation.
So you feel like you were a victim, you were being set up with a lot of misinformation, as opposed to, I should have come to it, I should have been clearer, I should have said something differently, done something differently?
I mean, I feel like if we want to talk about individual decisions or moments, that's one thing. But the idea that I was somehow late to this, I think, is a complete falsehood and lie. I was original co-sponsor of the ceasefire resolution, basically, as soon as Congress was back in session. As soon as Congress was back in session after October 7th, I was an original co-sponsor of the ceasefire resolution, pretty much as close legislatively as you can get. I was original co-sponsor. I was one of the first members of Congress, period, to designate what was happening in Gaza, a genocide, in a speech on the House floor directed towards President Biden. And it was almost like not amplified at all at the time, which is fine, but I don't control that, right? So just because someone became aware of it in July, August, September. Like, I can't control, when someone else learns about something. But I was up there in early spring. And for me, if we want to talk about, why I don't call it a genocide on day one, first of all, we had the October 7th attack by Hamas. But to me, that term is significant. It is important. It is something that must stand up to scrutiny at the International Criminal Court. It is something that is definitional. This is something that Palestinians not only are facing now, but this is also, of course, something that communities and peoples around the world have encountered, whether it's the Rohingya, whether it is, so many other communities suffering through this. And so to me, this is not something that we just say because of a bunch of comments on social media. This is something that we say because we are bearing witness to something that is transpiring before us, and that we have to make in my context, in a legislative and legal context, I have to feel prepared to make the case. And so when I felt that the case was ready, I made it. But to me, people may criticize it as late, but I think if we follow day by day what was transpiring in that time, and by the way, it wasn't like a light switch went off. We immediately called for a ceasefire. I called it a human rights atrocity. And also, people are very angry at me because I call out anti-Semitism where I see it. And I do think there's a distinct line. And no condemnation of what the Israeli government is doing does not equate to anti-Semitism. It does not equate to anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism does not equate to anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism is real. And anti-Semitism is on the rise. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I don't see it if I see it. And so, that may put me in a certain complicated space for people, but it does not put me in a complicated space with myself. And that to me is the most important thing.
So what happens between now and with everything that you've said, in the external critiques, your critiques of the Democratic Party, the frustration with so many young people, with the party, right? But you've got 2 years, right? There are 2 years until the midterms. So what do you think what can you do in these 2 years? And also understanding the way you say it, which is, I was, in fact, targeted for mis and disinformation. It has cost me externally, not internally. So how do you change all of that?
Yeah.
So that the Democrats have a chance at winning something?
I mean, and I want to be clear, like, I don't feel like this is like a victim frame when it comes to misinformation. Like, I just think this is the environment that we live in now. Like, there is even right now in this present moment, there's so much fear that people think that any police officer walking down the street could be indicative of an ICE raid. So this is something that we're contending with, right? And it makes the information environment challenging because we have so many people calling in ICE raids, but there's only a couple of them that are actually ICE raids. And so we have to, every time someone calls something in, we have to send a person out there and it can be a drain on resources. And so anyways, I say all of this because the misinformation environment is just everywhere. And the more a space thinks that they are immune to misinformation, the more susceptible and vulnerable they are to it, to be frank. Because what we actually need are people who are just willing to just take a beat. The moment you see something that is evoking an emotion, anger, fear, whatever, just take one beat to Google it, verify
Triple verify.
And it's really important to do because people will often amplify it out of good intention, right? They think they're standing up. They think that they're, amplifying information about ICE somewhere, but it needs to be verified. And if you're a person that's reporting it, if you want to notify people about ice activity somewhere, take a picture, make sure it says ICE on their back, make sure that it's labeled, identify the time, the location. That information should be there, and it should be there if you amplify it too. There are a lot of families and parents in our neighborhoods that are legally transitioning guardianship over their children to someone else, and they are preparing to leave their children here and to return to their home countries so that they can start the clock on their return. Because for people who may not know, if you're here undocumented and you want a chance at coming here,
you can't be deported.
You have to. First of all, you cannot be deported, and second of all, you kind of have to wait out a penalty period of about 10 years. And so, if their child is 8 years old, there are people that are already making the decision. They're transitioning guardianship. They're trying to protect their children. And they're making the heartbreaking decision to leave their kids here, and they are going back to their home countries so that in 10 years, when their child is 18, their child can maybe try to get their parent and reunify with them. And these are people who pay taxes, who are upstanding citizens, what have you. But anyways, all of this is to say, like, in this misinformation environment, what do we do? What do we do in the next 2 years? A lot of people have been asking me questions about the Democratic Party, and I feel like I have a famously tenuous relationship with the Democratic Party. I'm like...
So when people say she's too close to the party, you're like...
I'm like, receipt, please?
Somebody said, in fact, in prepping, they were like, maybe she has a lot of influence in the Democratic Party. And I was like,
I'm not like... I have a weird relationship with the Democratic Party. I am a dissenter. I am part of this coalition somewhat in a way, like almost reluctantly, in that I don't believe in a two-party system. If we had a multi-party system, lots of people would not be in the same party with one another, But I also understand that the Democratic Party is a coalition. And if we want the party to change, the balance of the coalition has to change. But right now, if you open the hood on the Democratic Party, what you have, I think, is a bit of a power struggle over the last couple of years. And also a transformation in how the party views itself. I think if you asked 5 years ago what the biggest fissures in the party are, I think people would say progressive versus moderate. And they will look at things through that frame, that there's like this neoliberal camp in the Democratic Party that is very friendly with corporations and business.
And always pushing to the center.
Pushing to the center. Others would say pushing to the right.
Right, to the right.
And then there is like this progressive camp. And even that progressive camp, like some of it is focused on working class politics. Others of it are focused on, especially like 5 years ago, like a more identity and identitarian politics as well. But I think that's changed now. And I think that it's not gone, but I think we are also having these other kind of cross fissures and conversations. I think there is a generational confrontation happening within the Democratic Party that is not complete. I think there's a lot of people that want to say, we're a new party now, we're hip, where it's new. No, it is. I think it's happening. There's a lot more newly elected Democrats that are out there, but they are not the by and large the decision makers in the Democratic Party. And so those decision makers are still largely, there are some shifts, but a lot of those decision makers are still not just the same people, but from the same school of thought. And so you can have new figures that still either ascribe themselves or have to appeal to people that still have to have this kind of understanding of politics that is, I would argue, 10, 20 years regressed.
Right.
The electoral coalition that Democrats went for and have been going for have largely been affluent voters. And affluent white voters have been like the central focus for quite some time. And I think that especially when we talk about Latinos too, one of the things that I think is, people will take like the election results very surface level. But I will tell you, in our community, the anger was less about like, oh, we need to deport immigrants. The anger, because these are immigrant communities, the anger was actually how the Trump administration and the campaign was actually very surgical and very sophisticated about drawing a wedge between undocumented people and recent arrivals and asylum seekers. That resentment exists because of the lack of movement on a path to citizenship. And so I think what is being misread about the moment, because so many people understandably are so disgusted with Trump that they tune him out. And that's certainly something that I did in the first Trump administration. I need to protect my peace, right? But as a practitioner of politics, if you did not listen to a single Trump rally, if you weren't listening to how they were talking to people this time around, you would miss that the Trump campaign was talking to people very differently this time around than they did the first time around. I think they've learned from their mistakes. I asked a lot of Trump voters and asked about Trump voters in my district. I did this online, but we actually went door-to-door canvassing as well. And when I asked people, where do you get your news from? Who do you trust? Increasingly, people are saying, I want to hear from the politician themselves.
Yeah.
And that they will believe what that politician says more than what the media says about that politician. And so when Trump says, we're not going to deport you, we're only going after the quote unquote like rapists and murderers, which, by the way, is already standing U.S. law. But when he says that, people believe him. And what you do with when a lot of people believe a liar is a tricky scenario in which we find ourselves. People used to trust media outlets more than they trusted politicians. And so, but then that credibility has eroded over time. And so what we do about that, this is the soil in which misinformation flourishes, in which, strong men can just say their things and people will just believe it.
So you went on Instagram Live, and which you're kind of back to doing that, right? A little bit more. And you talked very clearly about immigrants. You're like, by the way, let me just tell you the facts, right?
Yeah.
So I think you know this just because of the amount of time that I've been doing this, right? I'm constantly saying it's about the narrative and the journalism that we do. So you are, in fact, it seems, trying to correct the narrative, change the narrative, take control of it, flip the narrative. What is it that you want people to understand in this narrative of what Alexandria wants America to understand about immigrants moving forward is?
Well, there's two things. One, if you care about people and you have a compassionate case. But then two is also just a hard-nosed economic case. First and foremost, like this idea that people are immigrants or illegal, etc. We're talking about ourselves. This is the fabric of our country, the fabric of our community. And when people say, oh, I think it's fine, they just need to be here legally, they're shutting down all legal pathways. Like they're just shutting them down. Day one, the CBP One app, which I wasn't even a huge fan of, but when they say, oh, you want to come here, enter through a port of entry, that was the app, literally app for application, both
the legal way.
the legal pathway.
Even though you're going to have to wait in Mexico for who knows how many
Yes.
months, under who knows what conditions, but you want to do it legally. You're so desperate to do it legally.
Yes. So
sign
when
the app.
you shut down legal pathways, you supercharge undocumented pathways. And so that's number one. If you support and if you don't want undocumented people in this country, which, to be honest, nobody wants undocumented people in this country. We want people to be documented, right? We don't want people living in the shadows and in fear. These are human beings, but they are also assets to the United States of America. Now, when I move to the economic case, I want to say first that, yes, it is fraught, because it is painful to see sometimes people only talk about the economic case because we're more than just a labor force. We're more than just a people to be exploited. But let's be clear, the people who are voting in this way oftentimes don't respond to a case of compassion and humanity. And so if you want to be hard-nosed about it, understand that America's immigration force and our community of immigrants, including and especially the millions of undocumented people in this country, are why America has prospered, especially why we survived the COVID-19 pandemic. And for all of the people who cast a vote based on grocery prices and inflation, if you think your groceries are expensive now, wait until the farms are empty. If you think houses are expensive now, wait until there's no one building them. Understand the consequences of what this means. Because for America to not accept immigrants is the definition of cutting off your nose to spite your face.
Okay, so it is a different geopolitic, though. It's not different. It's very different than what happened in the first Trump administration. Mm-hmm. A lot of things have changed on their side, on the activism side, but also in terms of Latin America and world politics, right? So he went after Mexico, and the first woman president, Claudia Sheinbaum, had a few words for President Trump, went after Panama and the Panama Canal, went after Colombia and the president. So what's your sense of what's going to happen with the Latin American geopolitics of this moment and this administration?
Well, it's important to understand that the Trump administration and Steve Bannon, they have very strong ties in Latin America. They have been working with right-wing movements. There is an ascendant right wing in Chile, in Colombia, in Brazil, in all of these places that have direct connections. But you have these populist movements in Latin America that have taken foot, where those establishments did not necessarily prevail in squashing people's movements the way that they have sometimes happened here in the United States. And so you have the ascendancy of Claudia Sheinbaum, of Lula, of Petro, of Boric. And of course, everyone has their own challenges because governance is hard, but it is actually the first time we've seen these populist movements have a real opportunity at governance and showing people what is possible when people's movements actually gain power. And Claudia Sheinbaum's popularity is directly tied to these transformative social policies that they have rolled out in Mexico. And so I think we can expect that Trump is going to do everything they can to go after her, to go after all of these folks. Marco Rubio has already kind of done this in a lower key way, in a way that people don't really pay as much attention to, but he will hold hearings in order to try to threaten, I think, Colombia's current administration and politically undermine that administration, because in Colombia, understandably, there's a lot of anxiety around the stability of Colombia's relationship to the United States. And so if you get Marco Rubio from the Senate trying to undermine it, you can destabilize some of those politics. And so, in terms of the future, I think we can obviously predict that Trump is going to be hostile to the people who stand up to him. But if the people who stand up to him stand together, then we can keep an anti-democratic, small d democratic leader kind of as contained as we can. We can do what we can with that, which is why, it's like when Trump announced these tariffs after, Petro didn't even say we won't accept these deportees. He said, come correct. He said, don't send them on a military plane. Send them on the planes that you have been sending them on. And Trump wants to announce 25% tariffs on Colombia, one of the primary exporters of not just coffee, but flowers right before Valentine's Day.
Flowers.
Flowers, like I said, to approach the Latino community with hostility in this country, in the Western Hemisphere, a Latin hemisphere. This is a Latin American hemisphere, like the Caribbean, Central America, South America, North America. This is it is to try to approach a hostile relationship with Latina people in the United States, but also everywhere that we come from, is just not in our best interest as a country. It's just not.
Who, what entity, place, thing that you do to find that peace, that strength? Where's it coming from? Where are you turning to now?
But I think, as a Puerto Rican, Puerto Ricans have, I think, such a funny relationship to challenging circumstances.
To la brega?
Yeah, la brega, la todo, because we're the oldest colony in the world, right? And so difficult conditions are not a new thing for us. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Puerto Ricans are very funny and we're very loud and we dance a lot, and because it's like genuinely like it a conscious choice to be happy is a form of resistance. And this is something that sometimes I culturally sometimes feel a little disjoined from the American left. Like I actually feel sometimes more at home in a Latin American left culturally, because there's almost this idea that you're not allowed to be happy in the U.S. when there is suffering going on. And that is the opposite of, like, when you actually look at people who are enduring some of the deepest, most brutal regimes, they are sometimes the most conscientious about cultivating happiness, joy, gathering, music, dancing. My number one thing that I want people to know is, like, you're allowed to be happy. You're allowed to be happy. You are allowed to cultivate joy. In fact, you need to, because our job is to build the world that we want. And if we do not allow ourselves to gather with our friends, to be happy, then we are not reminding ourselves of why we're doing any of this. We cannot be joyless people. We will not sustain ourselves. We will not last long. And I think about this specifically in a Latino context and in a context of immigrants, right? Like, everything that they're trying to get us to do is trying to get us to hide and trying to get us to not exist in public. And for so many cultures and people, from, generations over, the way that we need to do that is that we have to express ourselves. We have to make music. We have to, I think what Benito is doing is like a perfect example of this, right? We are, from a Puerto Rican context, Puerto Ricans, what we're experiencing right now is such a deep pain at our displacement. We are being displaced. Like, not only is it a colony, but we are being actively colonized in another wave by American real estate investors. And they want a Puerto Rico without Puerto Ricans. And this is something that is a deep source of pain. And yet, when we make art about it, when we gather in it, when we fuel ourselves up with joy in that, then we become stronger than ever.
Thank you for coming into the studio.
thank you.
Appreciate it. Good to see you.
Thank you so much. Likewise.